This video was made possible by CuriosityStream. When you sign up at curiositystream.com/HAI, you'll also get access to Nebula, the streaming video platform that HAI is a part of. So let's say that 5.5 years ago, you had this great gig going selling Minecraft servers to middle schoolers and you made $172,000 in 1 year, which was amazing, but you were a teenager so you didn't really understand how taxes worked and crucially that you had to pay them. And then a few years later, you started a YouTube channel and it got pretty popular, and then a few years after that, you started getting calls from the IRS, which you somehow missed, and then you started getting knocks on your door, which you also somehow missed, and then you look at the internet and it tells you that you only have 6 months left for the statute of limitations to run out on tax crimes. If that were the case, a good place to go would be Antarctica. That's because during the 7-month period from around March to September, no planes, boats, or anything visit the continent due to the harsh conditions, and so the 1,000 or so individuals staying there will be totally and completely isolated. Of course, plenty of countries have research stations in Antarctica, but we want to talk about those of the British Antarctic Survey, not because we're all about that bass, but rather because they have something strange going on with their accents. Now, just 2 of the British stations are occupied year-round, Halley and Rothera. During summer, Halley will have about 70 inhabitants, while Rothera will have up to 130. In winter though, staffing is reduced to the bare minimum needed to keep the facilities running. About 20 to 30 at Rothera and 10 to 15 at Halley. As you can imagine, being stuck mostly indoors with so few people for 8 months, the overwinterers get close. Closer than Joe Biden to a woman. So close, in fact, that as a group they develop their own unique accent. This was discovered by a group of researchers from the University of Munich, so shout out to you, Jonathan, Michelle, Mary, and Florian. I'm sure being in an HI video is the recognition you always dreamed of. They recruited 11 overwinterers, 8 Brits, 1 American, 1 German, and 1 Icelander, from the British Antarctic Survey and recorded them saying 28 different words before their departure. Then, these 11 went to Antarctica. Now, what's interesting about this scenario is that it's one of the few ways to simulate the environment of isolation that created new accents hundreds of years ago. This is basically colonialism, just without all the pointy hats and killing natives. In the case of the British colonization of Australia or New Zealand or the US, the accents developed through an isolated group of largely British settlers slowly altering the way they spoke as a group, in part thanks to different non-British immigrant groups coming in. At the time of their founding, living in one of those colonies was just as, or perhaps more isolating than overwintering in Antarctica today. Now, a big way that an American or Aussie or Kiwi accent differs from that of a British accent is in the vowels. For example, in my super cool Mid-Atlantic American accent, I pronounce the vowel in trap the same as in bath. However, in most accents from England, Australia, and New Zealand, the vowel in trap will sound like my trap, but the bath will sound more like bath. Meanwhile, when I say pin and pen, they sound completely different, but in New Zealand, the vowel would be pronounced exactly the same. It's pin and pin. Also, in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, they would pronounce it as paid maternity leave, whereas in the US we would say, what? Given their importance in accents, vowels are what this study focused on, and the 28 words were chosen to be indicative of 6 different vowel pronunciations. They included words like keyed, kid, jockey, code, cued, and cooed. Upon arrival, the recruits were recorded again every 6 weeks for the entirety of their 8-month stay, and then the recordings were plugged into some fancy linguistics analysis software, computer, sciencey, electronic something to make it objective. They then used some fancy data analytics, confidence modeling, math number something to assure that any changes observed were significant enough that they could not be explained by chance. But now for the big question: what changed? Well, first of all, the average vowel length increased by up to 30 milliseconds, which is interesting and significant, but that's only sort of an aspect of an accent. What definitely is vowel pronunciation. It was found that, on average, after the winter cooped up together, everyone's vowel pronunciations became more similar, as in, they were shifting towards one common pronunciation. The biggest example of this was with the oo sound. Now, listen closely because the difference is subtle, but they started out saying food, but by the end, it sounded closer to food. What's changed here is where in the mouth the vowel is formed. In food, it's further back, whereas in food, it's further forward, so this is evidence of a shift towards what's called vowel fronting. Therefore, one of the first aspects of this Antarctic accent is vowel fronting. Now, the study's authors are careful to warn that the results from a small sample size of 11 are hardly conclusive, and they certainly were influenced significantly by the one German participant learning to speak English more similarly to a native speaker through exposure, but they still do conclude that these changes are indicative of the mechanisms through which a common accent begins to form in an isolated group. For example, one author points out that when humans first colonized Mars, a Martian accent will begin to develop in this exact same way, and given the much longer period humans will be away for such a mission, such an accent will likely be noticeably distinct within just a few generations. Of course, if you end up popping out to Mars, you'll have a long trip, and the best way to fill up that trip is by downloading videos offline on the CuriosityStream and Nebula apps. Now, I do have a recommendation for a first series to start on. It's called Working Titles, and it's where a bunch of educational creators go and analyze the title sequences from their favorite TV shows. For example, City Beautiful, the guy who makes urban planning videos, just released one on the Parks and Recreation title sequence, and then there are 14 others already out. As you probably know by now, the best way to get access to Nebula is through a subscription to CuriosityStream. They're, of course, the streaming site home to thousands of top-quality nonfiction shows and documentaries, whereas Nebula is home to original content by your favorite educational internet creators, myself included. The two are available as a bundle deal that costs as little as $20 a year by going to curiositystream.com/HAI and signing up for any subscription.